Okay, so you want to increase the rent that your tenant's paying. Well, there's a few different scenarios involved here, depending on the type of tenancy they're on. So let's go through them. So first up, we've got fixed term tenancies. Now, usually you can't increase the rent during a fixed term unless you have a clause in there stating that you will review it and on what basis it will be reviewed. So this would normally be if you've agreed a 2 or 3 year tenancy, and you may put in a clause for a rent review or a rent increase after the first year and then after the second year. If you have signed a 2 or 3 year tenancy with your tenant and you don't have a rent review clause in there, you cannot increase the rent. Unless, of course, the tenant agrees to it, but to be fair, that's going to be quite unlikely. So the simplest way to do it on a fixed term tenancy is offer a 12-month tenancy at the start, and then when that's due to come to an end, 2 or 3 months before, you contact the tenant and offer them a further fixed term, and at that point you would decide at what rent level you're going to offer them the further fixed term. Now we're going to talk about if you're out of a fixed term tenancy and you're on a periodic contract and you want to increase the rent. Now, before we do that, we also need to just discuss rent period. So you need to be aware that if you're taking rent in advance, say 6 months in advance or 12 months in advance, how you're phrasing that in the contract, because you may create a rent period longer than 1 month if you don't phrase it correctly. And the reason why this is important is for a periodic rent increase, then it has to be notice given in line with the rent period. So you could end up having to give 6 months notice of a rent increase without realising it. So let's talk about periodic tenancies now. There's 2 types of periodic tenancies. So which one is yours? Is it a contractual periodic or a statutory periodic? It is quite important to know which one it is because it will impact how you can do a rent increase. So ideally we're looking for a contractual periodic tenancy. Now, I'll come on to the reasons why in a moment, but a contractual periodic tenancy is created when the fixed term tenancy agreement has a clause in it saying that the tenancy will continue on a month by month basis after the expiry of the fixed term. Now, apart from the rent increase reasons, it's a good idea to have this in there because it means that the tenant can't just move out at the end of the fixed term, which they can do. It's a little loophole if it's not in there. So if you do have your contractual periodic tenancy after the fixed term, then the way that you increase the rent is simply by writing to the tenant, giving them 1 month's notice, if that's your rent period, as we covered earlier, of the rent increase. Now, you can only do this if you have a rent review clause in the original tenancy agreement. If there's no rent review clause in the original tenancy agreement, then you're going to have to increase notice in the same way as a statutory periodic tenancy, which we're going to come on to next. So a statutory periodic tenancy is created automatically under Section 5 of the 1988 Housing Act if the fixed term tenancy expires and there's no provision in the tenancy agreement as to what happens afterwards. So a statutory periodic tenancy is actually creating a brand new tenancy agreement. Because a statutory periodic tenancy is a brand new agreement, you will need to make sure that you reserve all the relevant prescribed documents on the tenant. This will protect you in case you need to serve a Section 21 notice on the tenant in future. So, to increase the rent for a statutory periodic tenancy, you will need to serve a Section 13 Form 4 notice of a rent increase. Now, what you do need to bear in mind is that this is a proposed rent increase. The tenant has the option to decline to agree to it, and they can take it to a tribunal who can review it and set their own rent depending on what they feel is the market rent for the property. So I hope that covers everything you need to know regarding rent increases. The rent period thing can be a little bit tricky to get your head around sometimes. So if you do have any questions regarding what type of tenancy you've got, how to increase your rent, how to check what your rent period is, then just let me know and I'd be happy to answer any questions. My name's Caroline from Franklin Residential.